So really what we wanted to do was I was going to talk you through some of my experiences personally working for DSW, where I've been head of apprenticeships since December of last year, and also experience I've had at ILM, where I was head of apprenticeships for 3.5 years and headed up their Endpoint Assessment service. So really wanted to share some of the good practices that I've picked up on and I've observed through conversations with training providers and apprentices and employers, but also to give Donna the opportunity to kind of contribute as well. So first of all, so you're not just listening to my boring voice for half an hour, but that you can also get it from the training provider's point of view and the way they're doing things and any lessons that they've learned along the journey. So the plan is we've got about 30 minutes of the presentation that I'll go through some of the examples and things, and then we've got the opportunity to ask questions. So we've put aside 15 minutes for questions at the end. The first webinar that we did was the first edition of this webinar. The questions went on for quite a bit longer, but that's great. We're more than happy to stay on and answer those questions if people want to stick around and the questions are still coming. So as I mentioned, my background is very much in education and training, and specifically apprenticeships latterly. So in 2006, I joined NCFE, and I was there for a period of about 8 years, where I had various roles in quality assurance and then qualification and assessment design. And a lot of that was actually working with sector skills councils to develop the framework apprenticeships and the NVQs and technical certificates that went into those. Latterly, when the levy came in, when standards came in and endpoint assessment, that's very much been my focus for the last sort of 4 years or so. Yeah, so if you want to just give us a little bit of background around yourself and your role and any experience that you've had of particularly endpoint assessment, that would be fab, Donna. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, my role at the moment, I'm operations manager at Skills Edge Training. So I'm supporting a lot of assessors with their learners with their endpoint assessment process in the way of carrying out practice professional discussions, practice observations, just to help them ready for their endpoint assessment. Also looking at their showcase evidence to make sure, especially for customer service practitioner, that they've got their best evidence available on the day. Prepping learners so that actually on the day they can take in their showcase evidence, because that's quite important. They're not aware of that, some learners.
Yeah.
And referring to that during their professional discussion. So that's quite important because that gives them a little bit more of a safety net if they need to refer to that.
Excellent. That's really useful, and we'll probably revisit some of those points actually throughout the presentation. So thanks, Donna.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, so the 3 key objectives of the webinar, I think first of all is to give your apprentices the best chance of meeting their expected gateway date. And I think it's really important that we do try and get them to gateway on the scheduled date, just because it gives apprentices a bit of focus, it gives them something to aim to, it keeps them engaged. But actually commercially, from the training provider's point of view, obviously you want to get them to take that date because delays will have an impact on achievement rates, but also on your ability to claim the completion payment. We also wanted to look at how to get the most from your endpoint assessment organisation pre-gateway. So what sort of support should you expect? What sort of questions can you ask of them? What kind of relationship can you build with the endpoint assessment so that they're there from the beginning to support you and your apprentices through the process? And lastly, we wanted to focus on some of the things that you can do on programme, and in particular the way that you structure your on-programme learning to best prepare your apprentices for EPA, because we want endpoint assessments to be a fair and transparent process for apprentices.
Brilliant, thank you.
It's brilliant. We wanted to be fair and transparent, but we also wanted to be an enjoyable process for them as well. Okay, so kind of back to basics and the fundamental of what is gateway. So gateway it's not just an arbitrary date that you set at the beginning of the programme. We do recognise as well, it's worth saying that we know it's difficult to set a date for gateway at the start of a programme, and each apprentice will progress at different rates. So it is inevitable that some gateway dates would slip. But what we would do is encourage you to let your endpoint assessment organisation know, just so that when assessors are allocated and things, that they can free up their time to do other work. But essentially what gateway is it's the agreement between the training provider and the apprentice and the employer that that apprentice is ready to take their endpoint assessment. And it's worth at this point, I think, taking a step back and looking at where we are in terms of standards as opposed to frameworks. So I think one of the key criticisms of frameworks was that apprentices would hold up their apprenticeship certificate and say, okay, I'm competent now. But employers were saying, well, actually, they had the certificate, but they couldn't necessarily apply the skills and knowledge effectively and consistently in their workplace, and they lacked some of the behaviours that the employers valued and actually needed in their workforce. So for that reason, we built apprenticeship standards and we built endpoint assessment so that you can have that external independent check of competence rather than kind of coaching an apprentice through a portfolio of evidence, which is what tended to happen in a lot of cases with the frameworks. So really, it's really important at Gateway not just to tick off the knowledge, skills and behaviours, but actually that the apprentice can demonstrate that they are actually competent and that they're effective and efficient in the workplace. And that call really is down to the employer. So while it is kind of a discussion between the training provider and the employer has the final say on whether or not the apprentice is ready and competent and ready to take their endpoint assessment. So for some standards, there are other specific things for Gateway. So for example, if there's a mandatory qualification, that will have needed to have been successfully completed and certificated before the apprentice can pass through Gateway. And obviously we have the English and Maths requirements. So your endpoint assessment organisation will need to see evidence of English and Maths. It is sometimes still an issue actually in terms of apprentices getting to Gateway and the evidence being presented for English and Maths in particular not being acceptable evidence. So I think it's really important that you don't just wait to Gateway and then check what's acceptable. Check as early as possible, because as an endpoint assessment organisation, there are only some forms of evidence that we're actually allowed to accept, and that comes from the ESFA. So they'll give us a list and they'll say, first of all, these are acceptable qualifications. Second of all, these are the forms of evidence that you can accept in terms of the apprentice having completed those quals. And typically what we can accept is either a copy of their certificate, which would be GCSE or Functional Skills, English and Maths, or we can accept a screenshot from the awarding organisation of a results slip which confirms that the apprentice has passed, or we can accept a screenshot from the personal learner record. Another thing that comes up quite often with English and Maths as well is learners who have overseas qualifications, if perhaps they went to school in a foreign country and then they came to study in the UK. Generally we can, as an endpoint assessment organisation, accept them. However, they need to be signed off on a case-by-case basis via NARIC, which is a website which you can use, and they do charge for that service. But it's really worth bearing in mind that if you're working with international students and they have international qualifications, check that as early as possible. Don't leave it till Gateway, because that can become a blocker. And it means the apprentice gets stuck on programme and then they need to continue accumulating the off-the-job training, and then they lose their engagement and things like that. Okay, so some practical things that we picked up from speaking to people delivering apprenticeships and from some of our own ideas and things that we've built in. So practice and assessment methods, it sounds obvious, but really practice. And what I would say is don't leave it until they've been signed off for Gateway and then run practice assessments. There's no reason not to start running those practice assessments earlier on in the programme. Any good endpoint assessment organisation will have mock and practice and sample materials that they'll provide. We certainly do at DSW, so if, for example, you're running Team Leader, which has got a multiple choice question paper in it, we'll provide you with sample question papers that replicate the style of the questions, but also use the same functionality. So not only is it important to run through practice tests, but also it's important, I think, to engage with the technology early on, so that the apprentice is familiar with it and they're comfortable with it. And I think that that's particularly important when you come to things like the professional discussion or the interview. It's all very well running through a mock test in a kind of a classroom with the skills coach and the apprentice, and they might perform very, very well. But actually you then sit them in front of an independent assessor using Skype or WebEx, and they haven't used that before. It can seem very artificial. But if they've had the opportunity to practice and overcome some of those psychological barriers, it puts them in a much stronger position when they come to the real thing. In terms of things like professional discussions and interviews, another bit of good practice is actually running those mock assessments with somebody that the apprentice isn't familiar with. So if you're working in your organisation alongside other skills coaches, for example, it's a good idea to run mock assessments with each other's apprentices. And again, that's because the apprentice might be really confident, they might answer questions very effectively when they're sitting with their own skills coach, somebody that they've built a relationship with and they feel comfortable with. But you're sitting down in front of a stranger and actually they can kind of freeze or they can panic and it doesn't get the best out of them. So I think running lots of mock tests throughout the on-programme piece is really valuable. Getting familiar with the technology is really valuable, and actually running those mock assessments with someone the apprentice isn't necessarily familiar with is also very valuable. Donna, I don't know if you've had any experience of that that you wanted to share in terms of the mocks you've been running?
Yeah, what we tend to do is I'll go out and do a practice observation. Mm-hmm. And also practice professional discussion. So if there are any gaps in there, like showcase evidence, that can be captured during an observation, and also if it's not captured during the observation at the endpoint assessment, it can be captured during the professional discussion. Mm. So it could be that, an endpoint assessor's looked at a showcase evidence and they've found that, but actually they can then try and capture that during the observation or the professional discussion when that's carried out. So that's quite good. But at Skills Edge here, we actually carry out practice professional discussions. I've done one yesterday with a learner just to help them build on, what the day's going to involve. And it's done in a very formal setting, as it would be on the actual day. So it just prepares them a little bit more. It's recorded, and then I give them feedback at the end. So it works really well. And we've actually had really good feedback from learners on how that's benefited them for the endpoint assessment.
That's great to hear. I can imagine as well, actually, if you've recorded it and then they've had the opportunity to look back and see and hear themselves, it's a really good kind of mechanism for improvement, I think. Yeah,
and it does help them. It does help them a lot.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Actually, it's worth saying, I think, at this point, and I don't know what your experience of this is, Donna, that one of the things that I've picked up on is that we have a real blend since the standards came in. So when we were delivering frameworks, I think it was very much assessor-led. And it was all about formative on-programme assessment of competence, whereas in the new world, it's more skills coaches or talent coaches who actually, the feedback we get from employers is they really value that because the apprentices are working with people from their industry who have some kudos, who can talk about their own experiences, and they're really good mentors and they're really good at motivating. But I think at the same time, the assessors that were delivering the frameworks have got that real assessment expertise, which really helps when you come in to understand what EP is about and practicing those methods and preparing the apprentice. I think the blend of those two skill sets is really valuable.
Yeah, that does help. That does help a lot.
Thank you. So the next one is around challenging and clarifying assessment plans. So I think this is a really important point, particularly if you are delivering a number of different standards, and particularly if you're working with multiple endpoint assessment organisations, because currently, DSW is approved to offer 29 standards. I have worked across other standards with other organisations as well. And what I can say is that very few of them, in fact, I would say that every single one of them has some level of ambiguity in it. There's very little consistency between the assessment plans because there was never a set template that the Trailblazer groups had to use. And in some cases, assessment plans are even quite erroneous, or they're certainly very complex in terms of the grading and the weighting and things like that. So I would not assume that an assessment plan that you understand how the assessment's going to work in practice, or if you've worked with one organisation, I wouldn't assume that another's going to do it exactly the same way. And that's really because of the ambiguity in those assessment plans. So I would very much encourage you to contact your endpoint assessment organisation early on in the delivery and say, okay, we're delivering these standards, what resources do you have? Can you talk me through the assessment plan? Can you talk me through the assessment instruments that you're going to use? Can you explain to me how you're going to grade my apprentices? And actually, can you talk about what the process involves, what technology you use, what are the timescales, what are the dependencies? Do they need to complete one successfully before they progress on to the next assessment methods? Each assessment plan is fundamentally different, and because they're so ambiguous, the way that each organisation delivers it can actually differ quite a bit. So I can't hammer that home enough. really engage early with your endpoint assessment organisation, ask for a WebEx, ask for a Skype meeting, ask for a face-to-face meeting, bring your skills coaches along, bring your quality people, bring your heads of apprenticeship so that everybody is reading from the same page and has the same understanding and that the process is very transparent. Because actually, if it isn't transparent for us involved in the delivery of it, it's not going to be transparent for the apprentice. So the next point is around testing competence objectively. So I guess this revisits the point that I was trying to make earlier on around competence isn't just that they've met the knowledge, skills and the behaviours, it's that they can demonstrate that. And in particular, think about the apprentice going into an interview or a professional discussion with an assessor who works in that industry and is going to know what competence looks like, and they're going to know what sort of questions to really test it. So not only can that apprentice talk about the knowledge that they've learned, but actually they can say, this is how I demonstrated it in the workplace, this is what I learned from that, this is how I shared it with my peers, this was the benefit to myself and my organisation, this is how I might do it differently. Okay, so it's not just about ticking those boxes, it's about that actual practical application of it, self-reflection on that on the part of the apprentice. Could I just ask if that you all check that you're muted, just there seems to be quite a noise on it. Still getting the interference. If everyone could just check that they're muted, and if you're not, just tap the mute button. Thank you. Okay. We'll crack on. So the next point is around your on-program teaching and actually ensuring that it matches the assessment requirements. So this is an interesting one. So one of the things that we've observed is, one moment, I'm just going to pause this. Still getting interference, so I'm just going to check if we can actually mute the microphones. My apologies. It is going to check that. Just want to make sure that you can all hear everything okay. Alicia's sorting this out and desperately trying to hide from the camera. There we go. Thanks, Alicia. Apologies for the technical interruptions, everybody. Okay, so yeah, ensuring that the on-program teacher matches the assessment requirements is really important. So I think that it's great using kind of qualifications and using curriculum and things, but actually if we haven't mapped that curriculum to the knowledge and the skills and the behaviour and the standard, when it comes to the endpoint assessment, the apprentice is going to really struggle to demonstrate that they've achieved those things. And actually, if we use the example of a portfolio, so in my experience over the years, it's been a real shame on occasions where a portfolio, for example, has been submitted for endpoint assessment and the quality of the evidence in the portfolio is really good, and there might be reflective accounts and recorded discussions with the evidence, and they can talk very articulately and with great confidence around their role and their organisation, and it's obvious that that person's really good and their employer thinks that they're really good, but actually if what's been taught hasn't been mapped and aligned to the knowledge, skills and behaviours specifically in the standard, then often those apprentices will fail their endpoint assessment, which is really disheartening for them and actually kind of undermines the view of apprenticeships within their organisation and beyond. So it sounds obvious, but making sure that everything that you're teaching is aligned to the knowledge, skills and the behaviours is really, really important. I mentioned earlier the issue around EPA date slippage. So this is common actually across the sector and across all of the endpoint assessment organisations that are working, is that quite a lot of the planned EPA dates are slipping. So obviously, as I mentioned earlier on, I would encourage every organisation to try and get the apprentice to Gateway on the planned date, but we do recognise that sometimes they will slip, and for very valid reasons. In those instances, I think it's really important to keep all stakeholders informed of that. So you need to let the apprentice know, because otherwise they'll be confused and they'll start to lack engagement, and they'll think, well, actually, I should have completed by now, what's going on? You need to let the employers know so that obviously they can free up the necessary time for the ongoing training, because until the apprentice hits Gateway, they're classed as being on programme, and you still need to keep meeting that 20% off the job requirement. And actually, if you haven't told the employer about it, and then you're saying, okay, well, we need this girl in, or this guy in, a day a week from now on until they complete the repeat, that's actually quite a hard sell. And I think it's also really important that you keep the endpoint assessment organisation informed, because most of the assessment organisations and most of the assessors that are working for them actually are kind of associates and consultants. So they will typically book the time in advance that they would be using to assess an apprentice or a cohort of apprentices. But actually, if you can let them know far enough in advance, it's fine, and they can reschedule the diary and they can pick up other pieces of work. So I think in terms of keeping the entire ecosystem live across the thousands of assessors that are working and across the hundreds of endpoint assessment organisations, I think it's really important, that ongoing communication. But also the other thing is make the most of all of the resources and all of the different organisations and institutions that are there to provide support. So I think your endpoint assessment organisation actually should be your first port of call. Speaking from a DSW perspective, we have very strong relationships with not only kind of the regulators, so Ofqual and the Institute for Apprenticeships, who we can go to if we have any questions or any points for clarification. But also we've got our eyes on the policy, so we can talk to you about things that we've learned or things that we're coming on the horizon. But we also have links to those employer groups, and in particular the Trailblazer groups. So if you're delivering a standard and you think, well, this isn't very clear, or such and such told me this and such told me that, the employer groups are a really good source of information, because actually they're the ones that designed the standard in the first place. Likewise, if you're delivering and you think you got some feedback on either the standard or on the assessment, let us know, and we can feed that into the Trailblazer group so that actually they can continue and improve the standards and improve the assessments through each iteration. Okay, so when to trigger gateway. So first and foremost is when the apprentice is competent. In the latest guidance from the Institute for Apprenticeships, they've made it more clear than ever that the decision on competence is the employer's. But I think in terms of the training provider, and in particular the apprentice's skills coach, they will have a view of the apprentice's competency, not just within their organisation, but in terms of the standard and in terms of the endpoint assessment that's about to take place. So the employer might think that person's great because they're performing well in their role. They might not actually be very well prepared for the endpoint assessment yet. So I think there is still a very strong role for you as the training provider to play in that signing off the gateway. Consistent evidence is really important, and actually current recent evidence. So when they're building portfolios, if there's some evidence in the portfolio that they did early on in the programme and actually you've included that because it was something that happens infrequently, that's fine, but actually bear in mind that when they get to an interview scenario, there's likely to be a question asked about that. And if it's something that they did 18 months ago or 24 months ago, it's probably not going to be very fresh in their mind. So actually, it's worth having a run through those knowledge, skills, behaviours when they get the gateway to make sure that they are competent and confident in describing what they've done in relation to each of those. Obviously, the English and Maths requirements need to be met, but I'll stress again the importance of making sure that in terms of the evidence you intend to provide to your endpoint assessment organisation, that it's valid and it's acceptable. The 20% off the job has been met, and that you've got the evidence of that, and we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail as well, actually, because we've got some good feedback around that. And that the apprentice understands how they're going to be assessed and what is going to be assessed. So again, the value of running through those market assessments and getting them to practice the methods and also talk about what they've done and what they've learned and how they've reflected and how they've applied it and how they'll continue to grow and progress within their organisation and beyond. Okay, I would like the opportunity to give Donna the opportunity to contribute now. Eddie, would you mind asking to say a few things?
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Your PAs as well. Sorry.
Thank you very much. So, are you there, Donna? Can you?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we were just wondering what your experience was, Donna, of gateway readiness, and if you've had any issues with people in particular having not met the English and Maths or met the off-the-job requirement in time?
I haven't had any English and Maths queries. I did carry out one endpoint assessment where the actual learner wasn't prepared, which was a bit embarrassing.
Okay.
When I turned up, the employer wasn't prepared either. So it's making sure that your learners are prepared and what the actual EPA process is. They weren't prepared that there was going to be an observation. They wasn't prepared about the discussion, and that there wasn't a meeting room booked. So all the little things that, you know, we take for granted, this person wasn't prepared for. So they wasn't aware they had to have ID on the day. That's all them little things, you know, he wasn't aware that he would take his showcase evidence in on the meeting. And something I sort of could stress as well is if your endpoint assessor is carrying out an observation, it's really important that you can't always predict what's going to happen on the day, but when I turned up to carry out an endpoint assessment for this learner, there was actually no evidence. So for about 40 minutes, I didn't actually capture any evidence.
Okay.
So it's quite important that, you know, something does happen, whether they're interacting with their employers or their colleagues, or they've got to make some calls, especially like for customer service. So, you know, for 40 minutes of that assessment, I actually didn't capture any evidence, and I was worried that I was going to actually have to fail the learner.
Okay.
So it's nice to plan ahead, but I know you can't always plan that customers are going to ring and customers are going to turn up, but it's always good to have, you know, systems in place. If something doesn't happen, you've got something else you're working on.
Yeah, I think it's criminal not to have transparency for the apprentice. They need to be very clear actually on what they're going to be required to do. I also think that employer buy-in is really important, and that the employer and actually everybody involved understands that this is a formal assessment. Actually, it's important and it needs to be done with rigour and with a degree of professionalism.
Yeah, and I did actually feel sorry for the learner because he wasn't prepared by his assessor. So, you know, he already is off to, you know, a bad start.
Yeah. And actually, I think it damages the reputation and the brand of apprenticeships, things like that.
Yeah, it does. So
what we want is for the... Sorry, go on.
Sorry. No, pleased to say that he did actually get a distinction in all areas in the end, which was good. So I managed to capture the evidence through a professional discussion, so that was good.
He must have been good.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that. What I'll do, Donna, is I'll leave you unmuted because I don't want to have to keep skipping through and muting you. So.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. So moving on to the next section, we wanted to look at kind of some of the reasons why gateway matters and what the delays can lead to. So I think the lack of engagement is a really critical one in terms of the apprentice, and particularly actually where you've got some standards, many of the standards that we assess in the financial services will have, for example, a mandatory qualification in, which is an industry qualification, a professional qualification, which is actually held in quite high esteem by employers and also by the apprentices themselves. And in a lot of cases, if the apprentices achieve that qualification and then they've got to take the endpoint assessment can be a bit of a hard sell, because if they see the value in the qual, which they've already got, there is the risk that they think, oh, well, actually, I don't really want to have an interview with this stranger. So it's really important that you keep them engaged, and it's really important that the assessments take place in a timely manner, because I think the longer that drags on, the less chance there is of the apprentice wanting to engage with it. So they either drop off or they don't prepare and they don't really perform particularly well in the assessment. The increased 20% off the job, I think, is an absolutely critical one. And I'll park that for now because I will talk about it. I'm just conscious of time, but I think that's one of the most important things that we wanted to cover today. The delayed funding. So obviously, you've planned in and scheduled in your payments from the levy or from the ESFA have been scheduled around that end date. And actually, once they get to the gateway point, their on-program's finished, your payments have stopped. However, as a training provider, you're still expected and required by the employer to support that apprentice, to keep them engaged and to practice, but you're not getting paid for it. So I think keeping that window as short as possible is really, really important. Okay, I think we've kind of covered off what the key requirements are and what sort of evidence that we need, so we can skip that one. And I shan't read this verbatim, but this is information that we get as an endpoint assessment organisation from the ESFA. So just if you're working with your teams and you're preparing people and preparing the documentation for Gateway, I would refer back to this slide, and it tells you very specifically what sort of evidence we can accept. So it's not us being awkward if we say we can't accept something. We are kind of bound to the rules that are set out by the funding agency. Okay, so just to recap on the things to remember, I think is that first and foremost is that the apprentice has demonstrated the competence against the knowledge, skills and behaviours, and that they've demonstrated against all of them. And you'll get a feel for where their areas of strength are and where their areas of weakness are. So really focus on those areas of weakness and get them to practice and get them to produce some examples of when they've done it for their portfolio, for them to prepare for their professional discussion. Have they demonstrated it? Have they applied it in the workplace? Is there a demonstrable benefit to them and to their organisation? What is the value for the employer? That is the whole point in the apprenticeship, is providing value to the employer. Preparing the apprentices and managing their expectations in terms of what the assessment is, what's involved, what type of assessment, instruments are used, but also the technology. So if they're going to be sat in a particular room in their business, for example, run the mock tests in that room, try and make it as familiar as possible for them so that when they come to the live test, it's not a surprise, it's not a shock, and they've got the best possible chance of performing well. Make the most of the support that's available to you from primarily your endpoint assessment organisation, but all of the other organisations that are involved as well. In terms of kind of DSW and our proposition, we in particular encourage early engagement and actually encourage you to register your apprentices early for a number of reasons. First of all, there's all of the reasons we mentioned around the complexity and ambiguity of some of the assessment plans. We've got toolkits and we've got instruments in place, and we're very clear on what our process is, and we want to share that with you. We don't want it all to be left to the last minute. We want to give you and your apprentices the best opportunity and the best chance of succeeding and actually having an enjoyable experience in the EPA. We also don't charge any fees up front at DSW, so there is no financial disincentive to register early. We would only charge the full amount for EPA once they actually get through Gateway and the endpoint assessment is imminent. And there's no penalty if you register the learner and they have to drop off for any reason. We're not going to charge you for that. Last point on DSW is that we actually allocate the assessor on registration as well. So what that means is that you can have the confidence that when you register your apprentice, when it gets to Gateway, they've got an assessor already in place, that we've got the capacity, there's an expert person there and they're waiting, and actually if you're communicating with them effectively throughout the process, you can shrink that gateway and you can get them assessed in a quite a short period of time. Okay, so a couple of points on selecting an endpoint assessment organisation. So if I were a training provider and I were looking at tendering out to EPAOs, there's some very specific things that I would look at. So absolutely I would look at price, because you've got finance directors, you've got CEOs who that's probably their primary concern. But I would also look at other things around the price. So what's the registration fee look like? Is there one? What is the resit structure like? But also I would focus on quality and what are you getting for your money. An interesting room, I had James on the previous slide, so James Miller, the CEO of Skills Edge. He said that they initially actually went for the cheaper option of the endpoint assessment organisations, but quickly learned that it was a false economy, and that you sort of get what you pay for in terms of the support that you get, so the one-on-one support for you and your team, but also in terms of the expertise of the assessors and the people that have actually designed those assessments. I think service level is really important, not just in terms of kind of core service level agreements, like how often do you, how quickly do you answer emails and phone calls, but also in terms of that one-to-one support that you get for an endpoint assessment organisation. So if you've got a really complex question around an assessment plan, do you know who to speak to? Will they answer the phone? Will they give the answer that you need? Will they work collaboratively with you to build your understanding and actually improve and refine their own way of working and their own assessment instruments so that they get better with each iteration and better over time, rather than just saying, okay, we've developed this product, there you go, see you in 12 months. I think the killer question actually that I would ask an endpoint assessment organisation if I were approaching them is tell me about a time when something went wrong. because actually it is still early days of endpoint assessment, it's fair to say, and I think any organisation that's done any endpoint assessments in quantity will have come up with some sort of stumbling blocks along the way. There will have been some lessons learned, but I think the really critical thing is how do you adapt to those challenges? What do you do in those instances? What contingency plans did you have in place? How effectively did you deal with that? How did you minimise the impact on the apprentice? What did you learn from it, and how did you improve moving forward? I think it's really important that you ask that question and that you get an honest answer to it. And I think that will give you a real good sense of the type of people that you're talking with and potentially dealing with. Okay. Moving swiftly on to the next slide. So I just want to talk about ongoing communication now. So I've made this point quite a few times throughout the webinar, but I think it's just the worst thing that we can possibly do is bury our heads in the sand and think of endpoint assessment as a necessary evil or just something that happens at the end of the program. Actually, it's an integral part of the assessment. It is the only assessment for the apprentice. I think it's really important that we have an honest, frank, open dialogue between endpoint assessment organisations and training providers, so that we have that mutual understanding. And actually, we can hide the wiring, but if you want any more of the detail that sits behind that, challenge us, let us know, keep the conversation going. Okay, I just wanted to move now on to the 20% off the job, because I mentioned before that so certainly from most of the conversations we've had with training providers in terms of, okay, what's caused slippage? So when an apprentice has had a gateway date in and they haven't met that date and it's slipped, and sometimes it might just be a week or two, sometimes it can actually be months. The most common reason that we get is that they haven't achieved the 20% off the job. And of course, from the training provider's point of view, if you put that person forward for endpoint assessment, we don't, as an endpoint assessment organisation, monitor 20% off the job, so we don't know whether or not that person has achieved it. However, if you then get audited by the ESFA and you don't have the evidence to prove that they've met it, obviously they're going to claw that money back. So I think for that reason, many training providers have been reluctant to progress through Gateway because they don't feel that they've got the evidence, or they don't feel that the employers actually allowed the apprentice to have that 20% or more off the job training that is needed. And the issue is that the apprentice then remains on programme, and if they're only at that point at, say, 15% off the job, well, they're not going to need 20%, they're going to need more than 20%, and that's going to roll on, it's going to roll on, it's going to roll on. And the likelihood of that apprentice ever taking their endpoint assessment, ever getting through Gateway, becomes slimmer and slimmer. So I think the 20% is probably the most important thing in terms of building that into your programme early on, building that into the conversations and agreements and contracts that you have with the employer, so that the employer understands how important that is to the apprentice's experience, to the apprentice's chances of success, but also to your ability to operate and to function as an organisation and to support them. Because if you don't hit the 20%, nothing else matters. So in terms of building that 20% in, I would say probably the most important thing that you can do is to front load it. So when you're scheduling in the off-the-job training for an apprentice at the beginning of the programme, I would strongly recommend that you seek to front load as much of that off-the-job training as you can. And what that means is actually you might get to month 8 of the apprenticeship and you're already at 18-19%. So if something does happen, which often does, so if the apprentice falls sick for some reason, or if business needs take over for the organisation and they say, well, actually, it's really busy now, we've had a couple of people call in sick, we can't release that person today for the training. That sort of stuff does happen, and it happens very often, unfortunately, and that's because employers will respond to whatever the need is on any particular day. But if you front-loaded that off-the-job training and you've kind of got that in the bag, for want of a better phrase, it prevents a lot of those problems earlier on. So it prevents friction between the training provider and the employer, and it also actually ensures that the apprentice has met it and evidenced it and they can get through Gateway on time. There's also actually an argument to say that front-loading the off-the-job training is one of the most effective models of delivery. Because what you can do is you can do the off-the-job training and deliver a lot of the knowledge requirements up front, And what that means is that the apprentice then has the opportunity to practice that, and they have the opportunity to apply that knowledge in the workplace and to do that repeatedly and to refine it and to perfect it, so that when they get to Gateway and they get to Endpoint Assessment, they're talking about something that they've done over a period of time, that they've done repeatedly, and that they've improved on. And in particular, obviously with Ofsted and their new inspection framework, that curve of the journey and the progression of the apprentice from day one to EPA is really important. So actually evidencing that is good in terms of achieving the off-the-job training, it's good in terms of satisfying Ofsted's requirements, and it's good in terms of preparing the apprentice for the EPA. Okay. So I think what we'll do is we'll move on to the summary. Okay, so communication is extremely important, and that's not just, okay, we're a week from Gateway now, what's involved in the EPA, let's tell the apprentice about it. Speak the Endpoint Assessment organisation from the beginning so that everybody knows what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, how it's going to happen. The apprentice has ample opportunity to practice. In our toolkits, we always supply things like portfolio referencing tables, where we'll list the learning outcomes and we'll say, okay, this is what a pass looks like for this learning outcome. This is what a distinction looks like. Now, if I were an apprentice, I would want to have seen that. And when I'm building my portfolio, when I'm building my project, I'll want sight of that. So the evidence I'm gathering, I know that it meets the distinction level, and I can evidence that and I can talk about it. Early engagement with the EPO links very strongly to the communication piece. I think is absolutely vital in making this a success. And I think planning for potential challenges, planning for things not going to plan, particularly in terms of things like the 20% off the job, I think is really important. Okay, so as a final summary then, I think selecting an endpoint assessment organisation for each standard and plan is really important. As I mentioned, each plan is significantly different. The assessment plan is a specification, so in theory, each endpoint assessment organisation is working to the same standard, but it's actually the ways of working, I think, and the level of support that differentiates between one organisation and another. I think stakeholder communication and actually doing some formal planning and strategy around that's really important. Making use of the training and support that's available, absolutely critical. And using a Gateway checklist, I think, is really useful as well. And we've actually produced one, which we're happy to share with you. It's free of charge. And that not only ticks the boxes for have they achieved the 20%, have they achieved the English and maths requirements, but it's also some of those checks of competence as well and actual readiness to take the endpoint assessment. So the apprentice must lead the assessment. The employer has to take this seriously. It is a serious programme. It's a formal assessment at the end, and I think that needs to be articulated to them from the beginning. And that there's a real role for the skills coach in helping the apprentice to map their evidence, helping them to identify where what they've done meets the standard, but also encouraging them and motivating them and acting as a mentor in their industry. Okay, so we have a question, what is accepted as evidence of an English and maths exemption? So there is a list which is on our EPA Pro, which is the system that you would access to register your apprentices, and on there we've actually stored the copy of the document that we got from the funding agency, which indicates what we can accept. So exemptions would be, so the core qualifications are functional skills or GCSE, but exemptions off the top of my head would include, I think, some of the old key skills qualifications, and there's also a list of equivalents from Scottish qualifications and things like that. I shan't try and list them all now. If I'm perfectly honest, I don't remember them all off the top of my head, but they are on there, and what I will do is ask Alicia to post up that list on the same page that we post the recording of this webinar, so you've all got easy access to it. We have a question, how do you feel knowledge can be best covered in the portfolio? Our endpoint assessment organisation is happy that the award degree qualifications have covered the knowledge. So we can't actually accept, so say if there's a qualification embedded as the on programme, or if it's a degree apprenticeship and there's a degree done as the on programme. What we can't do as an endpoint assessment organisation is we can't accept that as a proxy against the knowledge having been achieved. And the reason for that is that we are very much seen as the independent endpoint assessment organisation. So we need to assess it ourselves effectively that the apprentice has demonstrated that knowledge. And for us to accept the qualification would be essentially us deferring that assessment decision to whichever institution that awarded the qualification. So actually I can see from the apprentice's point of view that can be quite frustrating of, okay, well I've done this on programme piece and I've demonstrated this knowledge and actually I need to demonstrate it again in a portfolio. So what I would say in terms of minimising that assessment burden for the apprentice in particular would be doing something like a recorded discussion of a question and answer session where you're saying, okay, I know you've achieved your qualification, we're just going to have a half an hour chat here now where we just recap on your experiences and how we've applied that knowledge in the workplace. That's a really effective way of doing it. Synopticity is also a key part of endpoint assessment. So, for example, if an apprentice has demonstrated a skill where it's clear through their demonstration of the skill that they had to have had the underlying knowledge to have done what they did, then that can be used as evidence for the knowledge. And in particular, things like the professional discussion and the interview will be where that's drawn out. So the assessor will say, okay, I noticed you did this piece of work. Can you tell me about why you did it in that way and what sort of knowledge you used, what sort of internal systems and processes did you make use of, and those sorts of things. Okay. We have another question, which is, does DSW share any guidance to help understand when an apprentice is ready for gateways? Is something that EPAO should provide? So it's very much the decision of competence for gateway. We have to be removed from that as the endpoint assessment organisation, but we do have a template which we've developed, which we're happy to share with you. I mentioned it's free of charge, which will have some key kind of prompts, I guess, in terms of questions that you can ask of yourself and ask of the apprentice to ensure that they're ready for gateway. So I will also take an action to share that with the people who've joined today. So there's another one's come through, which is from working with DSW. I know you talk about registering apprentices at the beginning of their programme. Why should I, because other APOs don't ask for this? So really the reason that we ask you to register at the beginning of the programme, it's not mandated, but actually the best practice, which is encouraged by the education and skills funding agencies, that you register within 2 months. And the reasons that we encourage you to register early are, one, so that we can give you the full range of support that we have on offer in terms of the toolkits and the practice assessment materials and things like that. We also allocate the assessor upon registration, which just means that if every training provider that we're working with registers their apprentices early on in the programme, we've got a really clear view of our pipeline so that we can ensure that we're training enough assessors, that we have enough assessors to meet that demand, not just for one training provider, but actually for every training provider geographically. So I think there's a degree of altruism in it, in terms of you doing the right thing and doing your bit to support the wider ecosystem, so that we've got sufficient resources in place, but also it's really about the support for yourselves and support for the apprentice. It's worth saying at DSW that we have no issues at all with availability of assessors, because our business traditionally was built on an L&D consultancy. So we have a pool of 850 associates that we work with now, who've gone through a really robust and strict vetting process, people we've worked with for a long time. They engage currently with huge clients that we work with in financial services and in the city. So we can tap into that resource whenever we need. But by you registering early and giving us that visibility, we can ensure that we've got people onboarded who've been sufficiently trained and standardised, so that we're very clear that in a year's time we expect this many assessments to take place. Okay, got plenty more questions still coming through, so thanks for continuing to bear with us and engage with us, and we'll answer them all as long as they keep coming. So we have a question around approximately how long should a competency-based interview and professional discussion take? Would you recommend that these are completed back-to-back? So some of the assessment plans will specify how long it should be. Where they don't, we will specify in the toolkit how long we think it should be, and we base that, whenever we've made the decision, we base that on similar standards in terms of the content and the occupation, similar standards in terms of the duration of the programme, similar standards in terms of the level of the programme. So it's quite fortunate for us, I think, that we assess quite a lot of standards, so the 29, so actually we can benchmark it. Okay, well, it's very similar to this standard at this level, so we'll recommend the same duration for it. Would we recommend that they're completed back-to-back? I think it depends on what's being covered in the professional discussion and the interview, and it depends on how long they are. So some interviews it will specify in the assessment plan that it's a 2-hour interview and a 1-hour professional discussion, so that might be a bit too much for the apprentice in terms of them remaining engaged and getting the best out of them. Ultimately, it's kind of your decision and the employer's decision to make. But if we were to use the example of the team leader standard, which is one of the standards that we assess, I would encourage in that instance that they're done back-to-back, because from the apprentice's point of view, in terms of their experience, the professional discussion and the interview probably just feel like the same thing. So, and actually the interview, I think off the top of my head, is about an hour for team leader, and the professional discussion's around about 30 minutes. From the apprentice's point of view, that probably just feels like one interview that they're having with the assessor. So I would encourage, actually, in that instance, they're done back-to-back. Otherwise, it feels to the apprentice like they're having 2 interviews. So, thank you very, very much, everybody, for joining us. And thank you so much for the questions. And also a huge thank you to Donna and to Skills Edge. And I'll allow Alicia to unmute Donna so she can...
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, guys. Have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.